everyone. It is now Tuesday, June 23rd. This has been an unbelievable summer, tumultuous news from every quarter, whether we're talking about dealing with the pandemic or the racial tensions brought about by the police brutality and bringing it to the fore in American culture. And we have more great news from the Supreme Court, a decision that was very important to the LGBTQ community. And I'm so happy today to have an old friend from Connecticut who's now in West Virginia and heading up Fairness West Virginia, which is the organization that provides for civil rights and all kinds of rights for the LGBTQ community. So here he is from the beautiful state of West Virginia, Andrew Schneider. Hi, Andrew. Good to see you.
Good to see you, Sheila. Thank you for having me.
I didn't mean great that the other news that we had was great. I didn't mean the pandemic, of course, and the racial tensions that we're working on the issue of racial justice. They're not great. They're great in terms of being momentous, and I think I meant it in those terms. But of course, you were here in Connecticut as the head of the ACLU Connecticut, American Civil Liberties Union. And then you went down to West Virginia, where you had already in the past been the head of the ACLU in Virginia, West Virginia. Isn't that right?
That's right.
And now you're back. So tell me, how did you come back and what is it like in West Virginia now during these tumultuous times?
Well, I loved my time in Connecticut. I mean, it's the area from where I came from, essentially. I was born in New York City, spent a lot of time in Connecticut growing up. My stepdad lives there, and I have lots of friends there. And so I kept going back and forth between West Virginia and Connecticut in terms of my career. But when I took the job as director of ACLU Connecticut, after a few years, and after leaving West Virginia, the first time that I ever lived there, something sort of unexpected happened. I mean, I found that unlike any other place I lived, West Virginia seemed to be the place where the friendships refused to fade. Typically, I would leave a state like New Mexico or others where I would, keep in touch with friends for maybe about a year after I left. But gradually, because you made new friends in the new place that you were living, you would lose touch with those friends, and you would, make your social life about the people who were around you. Well, while I did that in Connecticut, and I certainly had friends from beforehand, and made new friends on my second time back. The friendships in West Virginia just never faded away. Many friends came to Connecticut to visit me, and I, in turn, traveled to West Virginia on many of my vacations. So it became clear to me that I really wanted to be able to find a way to move back to the state, because there's such a sort of generosity of spirit and warmth and hospitality here that is really unique to the state.
That's interesting, because we'll have some a little slideshow later where we'll show some photos of West Virginia and the beauty of it, because I think some of us in the Northeast are probably a little bit too insular and not very understanding about what goes on in West Virginia, how there are people like you and people of like mind and philosophy, probably in every state, and West Virginia has it too. So when we look at the slides that we have, people will get to see the beauty of it and the cultural, the iconic culture of the state that you now live in. But you're there to fight for fairness and for civil rights for the LGBTQ community. How did your involvement in that come about, and why is it so important?
Well, I had spent my lifetime working for ACLU up until I took the position with Fairness West Virginia. And the fact is, I never would have imagined leaving the ACLU, but what happened is that a friend of mine who actually had worked for me at ACLU Connecticut as my legal director for a short period of time, then went into went into film. I actually went to NYU Film School and then went to making films in Hollywood. And about in 2014, he asked me if I would help him raise money for an LGBTQ film festival in West Virginia, because there had been no such type of cultural opportunities in that entire region. And it was called the Appalachian Queer Film Festival. And he told me that, this is about two of your twin passions. One, define the stereotypes surrounding the LGBTQ community, but also define the stereotypes surrounding Appalachia, a region that is near and dear to my heart. So I said, yeah, that sounds really, really awesome. And I ended up taking some vacation down there and raising money for their film festival. And in the course of that, I encountered the two co-board chairs of Fairness West Virginia, who mentioned that people had put my name in the hat for the new executive director position that had just become vacant, and would I possibly be interested in it? And it just happened to be perfect timing. I said, yeah, absolutely, I'd love to. And
that's terrific.
That's how I ended up back in the state.
Excellent. So we know that Fairness is the organization that works for civil rights. The mission of Fairness West Virginia is to ensure LGBT people can be open, honest, and safe at home, at work, and in the community. That takes care of all the spheres of life. So, Andrew, I want us to go back, because before we get to that important Supreme Court decision, I want to talk about the trajectory of the rights of the community, the LGBT community. I go back so many years to a time when it was in the dark and when it was silent, when you didn't come out, when you didn't speak out, and talk about the fact that the rights for that community have moved so quickly in the past 10, 20 years. In the past 10 years, finally recognizing gay marriage is something that we are fighting for. Talk about the trajectory of this movement, how it went from in the shadows to out in the open. And of course, we're still fighting, and this case is just one of the prongs on the march toward complete civil rights. So talk about that for us.
Sure. So, LGBTQ rights in our country probably date back even before what most people recognize as the beginning, the Stonewall riots at the Stonewall Inn in New York City back in 1969. The first LGBTQ rights organization or gay rights organization was founded in 1924 by a German immigrant. It was, I think, called the Society for Human Rights, and it only lasted about a year because the police raids and police harassment ended up forcing it to shut down. And then there was not a whole lot of activity until essentially the 1950s. Another organization was founded called the Mattachine Society. And then, in the 1960s, there was, a lot of civil rights activity going on, including in the LGBTQ community, and in sort of copying the tactics of the civil rights movement for African Americans with the sit-ins. There was a situation in New York where basically bars would deny service to gay people because they feared being shut down. And so the Mattachine Society organized what they called a sip-in, where they disclosed their sexual orientation at the bar, provoking the bartender to refuse service, along with having press and media there to cover it. And that ended up getting rid of that, enforced, and then provoking a lawsuit, so that they could try to challenge this prohibition in court. And that's how they overturned those laws preventing service in bar, forbidding service to gay people in bars. And then shortly after that, Stonewall occurred, the Stonewall riots, which then I think accelerated more LGBTQ activism and got people out marching. It launched the beginning of the Pride parades in commemoration of it a year later, and and then more organizations got founded to fight for LGBTQ non-discrimination, and then the courts, started to get involved with the issue more rapidly. It was amazing in my lifetime. I just turned 50 a couple days ago, and just looking back, I remember when I was a teenager, when I was 16, the Supreme Court ruled in a case called Bowers versus Hardwick, 1986, in which they affirmed affirmed a law that criminalized LGBTQ people, and it was a horrible decision. I think it was a 5-4 decision. It was a close decision. But in only 17 years, I think I was 33 by the time the Supreme Court ruled again in Lawrence v. Texas that overturned that decision in Bowers, that decriminalized LGBTQ people. So in a short period of time of my life, the court reversed itself, and from then on, LGBTQ non-discrimination has been occurring in pieces much more rapidly.
That's so interesting. And so besides the right to marry, the issue comes up about do you have the right to a safe environment at your workplace? And can you be fired just because you practice a different sexual orientation than someone else, because you are gay or lesbian and so forth? So that was the issue in front of the Supreme Court just this past week. So tell us, what is Title VII? What is that all about? And how did that implicate the issue of gay rights at the court?
Well, it's interesting because Title VII essentially includes the provision of sex as a protected class in the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And initially, it was put into that legislation by segregationists who wanted to try to add a poison pill to the bill, because they thought at the time no one would support adding sex to the civil rights law, and so this will kill the bill. And instead, it didn't. And not only did it add a lot of case law protecting women from discrimination, it now has been extended to the LGBTQ community. Now extends to sexual orientation and gender identity by the Supreme Court and by one of the more conservative justices of the Supreme Court who wrote the opinion.
So now, if you are of the LGBT community, you cannot be fired because of that. And a lot of people talked about whether sex meant just the sex, male or female, or whether you could expand that definition, as Justice Gorsuch did, to include your sexual orientation on account of your sex. So talk about the fact that we now have a conservative Supreme Court justice that you were very skeptical about when he was nominated to be a Supreme Court justice. You, in matter of fact, wrote an article excoriating him because you thought that his elevation to the Supreme Court would bring about the loss of more rights for your community, for civil rights, for human rights, for LGBTQ rights. Talk about that and how, turns out, he lurched, what I call lurching into the truth, by coming up with a textualism argument that helped you. Talk about that.
Yeah, well, it goes to show that you can never entirely predict the way a Supreme Court justice will end up ruling in various cases, or their judicial philosophy for that matter. I mean, many presidents have kicked themselves for, in their minds, making a mistake in nominating a particular Supreme Court justice. And many of us on the advocacy side, sort of make mistaken assessments about how awful a potential justice might be, because once they get that lifetime appointment, they're insulated from politics to some degree, and they can be their own person. So that's part of it. And when I was approached by a national LGBTQ organization to write that op-ed piece, I was convinced by their argument that he had ruled badly on some transgender issues when he was a lower court judge. And so I wrote that op-ed piece thinking that there is evidence in his record as a judge that would indicate he will not be a good justice for us. And yes, I'm here to admit that I was mistaken, and happily so, because this was truly a landmark decision, one that will be incredibly helpful to the LGBTQ community moving forward.
Okay, so it does point out the fact that yes, judges can change their minds and can go against our perception of what they might do. That's happened throughout history. You mentioned Earl Warren, who was the governor of California, who Eisenhower appointed thinking he would be conservative, but he led the court through the great civil rights movement. So you're right, but we still have to worry about the court. I mean, we're happy that Roberts came in and joined that decision, so it was 6-3. But we have a presidential election, and the next president will have the opportunity to appoint 1, 2, how many justices. So it's still important, Andrew, isn't it, to make sure you get your politics straight when you're voting for president?
Yeah, no, it's very important. President has a lot of influence in who ends up with these lifetime appointments on the Supreme Court that basically make a lot of decisions about our daily lives, and not just LGBTQ equality and non-discrimination. Many other issues come before the court as well, as recently as this week with the DACA decision, and many others that the Supreme Court has dealt with this term.
Right, and so of course we're not out of the woods yet. Some other decisions are coming up, one on abortion, another one on the religious freedom issues. So we'll wait and see, and we'll be very careful about how we vote in November to make sure we have the kind of court that we need for civil rights and human rights. But let's get back to this decision. Explain the difference between this federal decision. So how does that change the fact that many states in the country have already passed laws giving rights to the LGBT community in employment? Many states like West Virginia have not. What does it do now to your state's rights about these issues?
Well, I think it lends a lot of weight to our argument that we need to have this law enacted in our state, in part because a very conservative court, probably the most conservative Supreme Court in our lifetime, has ruled on this issue that will help, I think, me, as I do much of the lobbying for my organization, help me convince a number of conservative lawmakers to support our cause now. Many of whom who had told me that they were waiting for the court to decide on this issue. And some people wonder, if it's even necessary for us to pursue this issue now that the court has ruled. And the answer is clearly yes, because even though employment has been settled and now employment discrimination is illegal for LGBTQ people, against LGBTQ people in my state, just like it is in all other 49 states, our legislation, which is called the Fairness Act, it also would protect us from housing discrimination and discrimination in public spaces, restaurants, okay. Hotels, or even, from, access to medical care. And
so is that the Fairness Act of West Virginia? Is that now before the West Virginia legislature, and now you can lobby for its passage?
Yes, that we have introduced that, or that bill has been introduced for now about 2 decades. It's been before the legislature for a long time, and each year we feel we get a little bit closer to getting the bill passed. We in the last legislative session earlier this year, we had a majority of legislators in both the House and the Senate to pass the bill. And the only reason that it never was voted on is because the leadership of both chambers refused to allow the bill to come up for a vote.
Okay. So hopefully you think that the impetus from this Supreme Court decision will help get it passed this time.
Absolutely.
Hopeful.
And again, another argument that echoes yours, that elections are important, not just for the president who appoints Supreme Court justices, but also for lower ballot races. If we can make sure that we get good leadership in charge of the House and the Senate in West Virginia and good legislators elected, then we can be assured to get this Fairness Act that is long overdue, get this Fairness Act.
Right. And so just to clarify for people, we have the federal law, which mandates you cannot discriminate in employment, but many states like West Virginia are grappling with state laws where other issues of unfairness are plaguing the LGBTQ community. So besides housing issues and public spaces, what are some of the areas where the LGBTQ community, including young people, are not being treated fairly, being harassed, or having their lives interrupted by discrimination?
Well, I also, besides talking about the sort of the challenges we face in West Virginia, I also want to make mention of how many strides, how much advances we've made in our state to demonstrate that West Virginia is not necessarily the place, going back to what you said before, that many people may stereotype it as. We back in 2015 in a Republican-controlled legislature, we were successful in passing a bill that allows transgender people in our state to update the gender markers on their West Virginia driver's license. That was a huge advance for us. I mean, it was an obstacle for many of our transgender brothers and sisters who were talking about how difficult it was to basically live their lives, because not having the correct gender marker on that reflected their gender identity caused numerous instances of harassment. Anytime your license is like your universal identification card, so every time you open up a bank account, you have to furnish it. Every time that you board an airplane, or every time that you apply for a job, and of course, particularly if you're stopped by the police. And every one of those instances, transgender West Virginians would tell us about instances of harassment, if not outright discrimination. And so getting this law passed was a big deal for us, and basically resolved a lot of the troubles and headaches that transgender people had to face. And and also breaking stereotypes. We did this. I think we were the 33rd state to do that. So we didn't come in last, which I think is a stereotype of people in our state.
Yeah. Now let's talk about, so one piece of legislation is the Fairness Act. You just talked about that would cover housing and public spaces besides employment, which the federal government took care of. Then you have the Youth Mental Health Protection Act. Mm-hmm. And explain that, because we see it all over, especially issues having to do with Facebook and social media, how young people of all types of young people, but especially in the gay community, are harassed and bullied and discriminated against that way. So tell us about young people and why that act needs to be passed.
Well, it's the so-called practice, or the practice of the so-called conversion therapy. It's an awful name because the medical science out there demonstrates that proves that you can't change your sexual orientation, you can't change your gender identity. It's something that you're born with, and so this whole practice of trying to prey upon, particularly in smaller town America, people who are worried based on their religious beliefs, or young teenagers who are afraid of the stigma of being who they are, and also afraid of disappointing their parents who partake in this, are partaking in something that is a fraud. It's a dangerous and discredited practice, and in my view, it's essentially medical malpractice, because anyone who practices this with a medical license should not. I mean, it's nothing but medical malpractice, and that's essentially what the bill addresses. The bill makes sure that no one who has a medical license can carry out this discredited and dangerous practice. And I say it's dangerous because many kids have committed suicide as a result of having to undergo this treatment. And when they finish the treatment and find out that they still have these desires, they still are of that sexual orientation or that gender identity, that and the way they become desperate. And suicide is of course the most extreme outcome of the harm that can happen from this practice. But certainly many LGBTQ teenagers turn to drugs and other escapes to avoid the reality that is incredibly unpleasant for them in many of these small towns in West Virginia.
Yeah. So that brings up 2 points that I'm thinking about related to that. The first is the statement that you made that science has determined that you can't change your gender identity or sexual orientation. That's built in. And that is huge, because I think so many people who are anti-LGBTQ would say to you that it's a choice. And we know scientifically that's not true. And I think that has helped to revolutionize the fight for rights for them. The other issue is the role of the religious community, because this conversion practice is very much something advocated by the evangelical and some of the other religious organizations. And of course, in tandem with many times the parents of these young kids, who the parents are convinced that their children are going the wrong way and need to be, quote, converted. So talk about that, because I see even in West Virginia, or everywhere, I shouldn't say even, the many religious organizations are standing with you and supporting you against this conversion therapy, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's amazing how far public opinion has moved in our direction. And I was just going to make another observation about the Supreme Court decision. Supreme Court, even though the justices are insulated from politics, they are not immune to the political winds of the general public. And in fact, when they typically make these landmark decisions, they're typically reading the tea leaves of public opinion, as well as invoking case law. And the fact is, the vast majority of Americans are, first of all, know someone who is LGBT, or particularly lesbian, gay, or bisexual. We still have a lot of work to make sure that people are informed and educated about transgender people. But we have come, a long way in a short period of time in terms of how people's opinions have shifted. Here in West Virginia, about a little over 60% now believe that there should be no discrimination against LGBTQ people, and that's remarkable for a state like a rural state like mine. And that's also reflected among religious leaders. We were pleasantly surprised when we started this project called Faith is Fairness, trying to retake the mantle of religion from those we believe have hijacked it, to attack us, because essentially that's been the largest source of attack against our community is sadly come from religion. When in fact we see religion as being potentially the strongest defense of our cause. I mean, in all major religions, there's some version of, in my religion, Judaism, it's love thy neighbor. It's part of the Ten Commandments. And in Christianity, it's the golden rule. Do unto others as you would want them to do unto you. All religions have some version of that. And that to me explains in a nutshell what I'm doing for a living, is essentially trying to convince people to adopt, for Jewish people, the Ten Commandments, or adopt the golden rule for Christianity. And the same thing is true for Muslims and other religions. So we started this campaign to try to try to inform people about what the true meaning of religion is. And in the course of that, we started this video project where we had, I think, more than 60 faith leaders of all different denominations around our state go on video and talk about why their religion compelled them to support LGBTQ non-discrimination. And following that video, which was very successful, we ended up trying to recruit those and more to support our legislation, the Fairness Act. And we ended up exceeding our goal, which was 100. We ended up with well over 100 faith leaders of all different denominations, once again, even some fairly conservative ones, like some Baptist, Pentecostal, an apostolic Pentecostal pastor endorsed the legislation. So we had a wide variety and a wide diversity of faiths represented. And then we had a press conference this winter at the beginning of our legislative session to announce that we had met this milestone. So this is changing rapidly, and that's why I feel so optimistic that West Virginia could be one of the next states to adopt this law. Right now, with Virginia being the last state to adopt the non-discrimination law, which goes into effect in July 1st, just a couple days from now, by the way. We hope that we can become the 22nd state, and I think that is not an unrealistic goal. That's how optimistic and excited I am about the future.
That's great. So I wonder, with all the progress that has been made over the last 10 years or so, as you said, rapidly, really, considering the sweep of history, are there still people in the shadows, in the dark, afraid to come out, afraid to be discriminated against, afraid to tell their families? And what do you know in terms of statistics about the percentage of gay, lesbian, bi, and trans people in America in general? Are there statistics that give us some the quantification of it?
Well, yes. In fact, you might find this interesting. The Williams Institute out of UCLA did a study of transgender people, the percentage of transgender people in America, and found that West Virginia had the highest percentage per capita of transgender youth than any other state in the country. We were surprised by that, just like anyone else was. And what was interesting is that we did not hold on to that, that level of being the highest number once you looked at adults. So something was happening. We realized something was happening to transgender people once they came of age, and we suspect that many of them are probably leaving our state. West Virginia loses more population than any other state in the country, and part of it is because of the poverty here, the lack of economic opportunity in West Virginia, but also a large part of it is the perception and the actual experience of not feeling welcome, not feeling included in society. And in many rural parts of the state, life can be very hard for people, and particularly transgender people. So we wanted to do something to be able to change that. And we felt the only way to change that was to make sure that transgender people could live a happier, fuller life in our state with less discrimination and more opportunity. And one of the things that we quickly found was that transgender people had virtually no access to health care here in our state. That for even basic services of, therapy, just to find a therapist here, some of them would travel to the nearest large city, metropolitan area, which was outside of our state. We really don't have any. They said our largest city in our state is 50,000 people. And so transgender people were traveling to Columbus, Ohio, or Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, or DC to access basic medical care. And others were just leaving because that is often, too much of an expense. They can't afford to be able to travel that distance. So, we thought that was certainly a big part of it. But also, there's also the possibility that transgender people may, have been going back into the shadows, not being counted as adults because life is difficult and they don't want to risk the stigma and the discrimination that they would likely experience if they lived an open public life. So,
Do you have any statistics, as I was asking, on the percentage of the gay community in the United States? Is it 1 out of 10 approximately?
well, in West Virginia, we've estimated it as, and I think this was based on some other study, although I don't know the organization that conducted the poll, but we believe it's about 2.7% of our state's population is LGBTQ.
That's interesting. And is that similar to other states in the country?
Roughly so, yes. I mean, I would imagine in urban centers you probably find a higher percentage, but that's
So you bring up another important issue of healthcare and how access to healthcare is denied not just to the LGBTQ, the transgender community, but to other people all around the country. Maybe 30, 40 million Americans don't have health insurance. And of course, a few weeks ago, the Trump administration announced they were going to take away rights for transgenders in terms of the Obamacare healthcare package, which gives healthcare to everyone. So that you're right. Healthcare is another big issue. We need universal healthcare to take care of some of these issues, right?
Absolutely. And what we're doing in West Virginia is we have started these trainings of healthcare professionals to provide competent, compassionate care to transgender people. And I hired a transgender organizer who is really good at doing these presentations. And before the pandemic, she was going to conferences of healthcare professionals or speaking to other groups around the state to train them. And sometimes it's not just about providing the care; it's about who is in the front office. If the receptionist in the front office doesn't use your proper pronouns, even after knowing what pronouns you wish to be used, and treats you poorly while you're waiting for your appointment, or just maybe even discriminates against you in other ways, that can leave you with an experience that makes you not want to go back to that office. And we've seen experiences where a doctor has is required a full a full examination of one's genitalia before treating a patient with something entirely unrelated. I mean, just some outrageous examples of ignorance and hostility towards transgender people.
Right.
Is unacceptable.
Right.
And so out of all this, we've created a guide now of all the people that we've trained and approved providing compassionate, competent care, so that on our website we have an interactive map of where a transgender person can go for basic medical care now. And I think that it's starting to make a big difference in our state.
Good. All right, before we get to our slides we want to show, I just want to touch on the area of hate crimes. There are some people who think that we already have enough in the penal code to take care of any issues of harassment or assault and so forth. Why is it important to have a separate category in the penal code for hate crimes against people because of their gender or their sexual orientation?
Well, because hate crimes are a very unique crime. They do not only target the individual, but they also target the group from which the individual belongs to. And that has a chilling effect that instills fear in that community. And just like other crimes that have enhanced penalties because they're particularly odious compared to the base crime, for instance, you get an enhanced penalty for premeditated murder versus murder in the heat of passion, or there's an enhanced penalty for murder of a law enforcement officer and so forth. Throughout our penal code, we have enhanced penalties, so it's nothing new.
And why are people opposed to it? You hear the more conservative people in the political spectrum say, we don't need that. We already have enough laws on the books to take care of that. Why are they opposed to it?
Well, because society needs to take a firm stand that the laws that are based on, the actions, criminal actions based on hate are particularly odious and basically necessitate a stronger penalty than what the base crime calls for, as in part a deterrent, but also in part as sort of part of the larger education that we need to do with society, that certain behaviors are unacceptable. Now, of course, I am an ACLU man. I always will be, even though I'm not working for the ACLU anymore. And I would never be in favor of something that infringed on free speech and free expression. So this legislation does not do that. You are not going to be penalized for saying bad words. You're not going to
right.
be punished for that. But you are going to be punished for committing a violent act based on hate. That is action. That is not just expression. And there's a big difference there.
Right.
I also want to add, before you move on, I want to add that our bill is a little different from your typical hate crimes bill because it has a restorative justice component. And we feel that is really, really important to addressing these types of crimes. So, we don't like my ACLU colleagues, we don't want to see, an increase in incarceration in our society. We are already an over-incarcerated society. So if there's a way to get around enhanced jail time, that's great. And what would be better than this restorative justice program, where if you are convicted of a hate crime, a judge can punish you not with additional jail time, but by doing community service with the community that you've harmed. By, in some cases, if the victim is okay with having a dialogue, even having a dialogue, so that the offender can learn what terrible harm they did to the community and the individual by acting on this hate crime. And even if with the usage of restorative justice, that does not exclude the initial jail time for the basic offense. You would still, for vandalism or for assault or even murder, you would still serve jail time for that crime itself, but the enhanced penalty part might be community service instead, might be requirement of reading about the culture of that community that you harm, so that could possibly change the hearts and minds of those who offended, and they don't just languish in jail for another 5-10 years and only hang out with their white supremacist gang members and become hardened in their hatred. That's not what we want to see out of this punishment. We want punishment in some ways, in large ways, or in every way, to be really rehabilitative. And so this restorative justice approach to hate crimes, I think, is the right approach, and it's worked very well in places like Colorado. So we would like to emulate that here.
What are the chances of that passing in West Virginia?
Well, of all three bills that I work on, this bill probably has the least support in the legislature. But that's not to say that it may change. I've talked to legislators who say, I can't support your Fairness Act, I can't support your ban on conversion therapy, but I do like your hate crimes bill. So, it's always possible that in the next legislature, that bill could start to see movement, whereas the other bills don't. But yeah, right now it has the least amount of support, and we hope to change that. We need to change that because we do see hate crimes in West Virginia, and quite recently so, even here in Charleston.
Okay, great. All right, I'm going to share my screen now so that we can take a look at West Virginia and the fairnesswestvirginia.org. Let's take a look. Can you see that, Andrew?
Yes.
Okay, and that's you with some of your colleagues.
It's our Lobby Day press conference.
Okay, and you've got all kinds of people there, and that's your group. And I wanted to show photo. Look how this is West Virginia. It's a small state. It's not a large state, right?
Well, it's you drive from one end to the other, which I have to do from time to time, and that can be if you drive from Huntington to the Eastern Panhandle, that can be about a 6-hour drive. Right,
but it's shaped kind of funny.
Yeah,
the way it goes around.
I read something once that by a sort of I think it was some sort of encyclopedia where the author said that if you were to iron out the state of West Virginia, it would probably stretch from one coast to the other because it is such an oddly shaped state, and it is big. It's bigger than most people think.
Right. It's beautiful. Of course, these scenes are taken during beautiful autumn, so it gives it an extra special color, but it's beautiful. And you've got the mountains, and you've got that's beautiful scene of the railway.
It really
beautiful,
is. One of my favorite pastimes is biking. And I can't tell you how much of a welcome escape that was for me during the pandemic. When I can't socialize with people, and I have to find some way to get out of my cooped up apartment, and getting out on the beautiful bike trails here in my state is been a relief.
Have you visited this Dunloop Falls on Dunloop Creek? Have you been there?
No, I don't think I have. I mean, there's so much to see in West Virginia. I haven't seen all, even though I've been here for some time.
Oh, that's beautiful. More beauties. Wow. This is in the Appalachians, right? People realize it's part of the Appalachian mountain range.
West Virginia is the only state that is completely within the Appalachian Mountains.
Wow. Beautiful. Beautiful. And this is one of this. I don't know if this is Charleston, the capital, or one of the other
No,
towns, but it's.
Harper's Ferry.
Oh, that's right, Harper's
That was
Ferry. This
Park
right,
behind the civil rights. The Civil War. I mean, where
right. That was there was a an
John Brown,
insurrection
the armory.
by John Brown,
Yeah, and it's
and
beautiful.
Harper's.
Right
It is
above there is
beautiful,
the Appalachian Trail.
right? And Harper's Ferry is partly in Maryland, partly in West Virginia,
Now, Harper's Ferry is entirely in West Virginia.
entirely in West Virginia.
Mhm.
And that's one of the big
Greenbrier.
famous resorts, the Greenbrier Resort in West Virginia. That
Silver Springs.
fancy people go to these big elaborate conferences and confabs and right.
Yep, it's owned by our governor.
It's owned by your governor.
Yeah.
Wow.
It has a lot of history. They built a bunker in there during the Eisenhower administration in case there was a nuclear holocaust. Congress would come down there and, stay there during the potential holocaust. It's no longer used for that purpose, but you can now tour it.
Wow. And that's the capital. You
What-
said Charleston only has how many people?
It's just under 50,000 people, and it's one of the most beautiful capitals that I've ever seen in the country. And I believe Connecticut has a very beautiful capital too, but West Virginia is gorgeous. West Virginia's capital is gorgeous, and
There
it was
you go.
designed by the same architect who designed the U.S. Supreme Court.
Ah, now what's the name of the river that it's on?
It's the Kanawha River.
Uh-huh. Beautiful. No, there's some beautiful scenes of the city.
Mm-hmm.
And
Capitol Street,
that's Capitol Street. Beautiful.
downtown Charleston.
Another street,
Mhm.
same street.
Yeah, that's also Capitol Street.
Yeah. And that's a beautiful photo of the cap. That is a beautiful capital.
Yeah, it's nice where I live. I live up on a hill, and so I have a view of downtown Charleston with the Capitol. It's definitely a breathtaking sight.
So you spend a fair amount of time lobbying. Do you go inside this building and lobby the legislators on the various legislation you want?
I do, and it's important to have comfortable footwear because the marble floors can take a toll on your feet. If you're not
Here's the Supreme Court. I don't know if this was taken on last week or when they had the legal arguments on the case, but this is the U.S. Supreme Court. Another view of the court. Workers, it must be the recent case because protect LGBTQ workers now, don't roll back civil rights. It must be related to the recent decision.
Yeah.
And here's more from your organization. If you face discrimination, we want to hear your story. So do you get people reaching out to you all the time?
We do, and it's important because last legislative session earlier this year, several lawmakers were quoted in the newspaper as saying they didn't believe discrimination against gay people existed, and we were like, "What?" I mean, like that. So we started this campaign, the Your Story Matters, to bring in additional stories, and just recently, it hit the news that a member of the Board of Education in my county said during a hiring process for the South Charleston high school principal that he would never hire a lesbian, and one of the leading candidates happened to be a lesbian. So there, we have been recruiting stories, but you don't even need to recruit the stories. The stories, sadly, are there to see for everyone to see.
Did they make a decision yet on who to pick?
Well, they did. They made the wrong decision. That's how it hit the news. They chose
Oh,
much less qualifications instead of the lesbian candidate who was extremely qualified, who even received the highest score in the evaluation process. Yet she was turned down. So the board of the Public Employee Grievance Board ruled that the decision was flawed and had to be redone.
so what's the status of that now?
It's still pending. In fact, the woman who did not receive the job, we believe in part because of her sexual orientation, in large part, is pursuing her case in circuit court.
Oh, okay. Stay tuned. We'll get the decision.
Yeah.
Now, winning Title VII and where we go from here. So that was something that you did right after the decision. You had a discussion, a
Yeah.
digital town hall.
With several of our allies, including the ACLU director and several local advocates.
Right. And of course, you partner with the ACLU. So this Martin Luther King quote, yeah, is important.
Yes.
Speak up, speak out. This was a mart. Was that a Pride Day parade, perhaps, or?
Yes, that's exactly what that is. And unfortunately, because of the pandemic, all the Pride festivals and parades have been canceled. But we're hopeful that they'll be able to many of them will be able to reschedule in the fall. And
I hope you're right.
That we have is the fact that this Supreme Court decision came down during Pride Month, so that even though we can't celebrate publicly, we all can rejoice in this great decision in the Supreme Court.
Okay, it is important. We didn't mention, yes, that it is Pride. It is June is Pride Month.
Mm-hmm.
And normally around the country, I've been to the one in New York City a few times. They have very wonderful, elaborate Pride Day parades.
Right.
And this first out trans person elected in West Virginia.
Yes.
Terrific.
It was great news. And that was just exactly a week ago. Rosemary made headlines as the first elected trans person in our state's history. And she's wonderful. It's so important. I don't know if everyone realizes this, but it's so important for government to reflect the people that they represent. And the election of Rosemary, beyond being historic, now provides all of these transgender teenagers who we talked about earlier leaving our state. She provides people now with a role model who they can look up to and see that West Virginia is moving in the right direction. I think that's so important.
Lobby Day. So you have people come to the Capitol to help you to lobby their legislators for different legislation?
Yes, and that was the first picture you showed at our press conference at Lobby Day. We do it every year. It's usually at the beginning of the session. And not only is it great in terms of showing how much support there is behind the issues we lobby for, but it's incredibly empowering for the supporters of ours who show up for it. We train them. We set up meetings for them with their legislators, and they see how they can actually make a difference in the political process.
So now you've got a lot of kids that are involved in your programs.
Mm-hmm.
And what is this young man? Best day ever. What is he doing?
This looks like it's one of our events. It could be we had a sort of a event that we supported. We were co-sponsors of called the story hour with drag queens who would read children's books, and it became controversial because there were some right-wing legislators who tried to make hay out of it, and they received threats, and it just got really ugly. But I think that might be what this picture is, and I'm not positive though.
Now look at that hair. That hair looks terrific.
Yeah.
That's good. Protect trans kids. You're suing the ACLU Virginia. I'm sure you're supporting whatever their ACLU is doing on this front. How often is this happening in the schools?
Yeah, that was. Yeah, that was a really awful situation in Harrison County Public Schools, where a vice principal followed a transgender boy into the bathroom, and
Yeah. Are you there, Andrew? Well, let me go through. This is another girl with a project. Transgender rights are human rights. Transgender youth again. Beautiful artwork in the city. Books do not indoctrinate someone to change their sexuality. I grew up reading plenty of books about men and women falling in love, and yet here I am, still a gay man. That was our guest himself, Andrew Schneider, the executive director of Fairness. And so we're going to come back to our show. I think we may have lost Andrew, but I think he gave us some important words about the Supreme Court decision, about the still many issues where gay, lesbian, transgender, bisexual people in this
sorry,
country.
I just got kicked off.
That's okay. We got you back, and I went through the slides, and I ended on your quote about your life and how you have always felt that you can express yourself and how you are in this world. And so we went through those slides. I know we got you back, but we're going to have some final thoughts. You do wonderful work. We support you here in Connecticut.
Thank you.
Remember the work that you did and the times I spoke to you about civil rights and civil liberties. And the LGBT community in West Virginia owes you a debt of gratitude for all that you're bringing them in terms of your experience and your expertise on these matters. So give us some final thoughts about kind of where we go from here, the importance of this decision, but how still a lot of work is yet to be done.
I'm having trouble with the connection. Can you hear me?
Go ahead. Yes, we can hear you. Go ahead. I asked you for some final thoughts.
Okay.
About where we have to go.
Question again because it went in and
out. Okay. I was asking you to just give us some final thoughts about where we go from here.
Final thoughts?
We had a great decision, but we have to keep going. And what do we still need to do?
Okay. Well, this was a great decision, and it will make a huge difference in the lives of LGBTQ people. Honest people can now earn an honest living. That's huge. But there are still many basic civil rights that we still need to win to put us on an even playing field with everyone else, and that includes being protected from housing discrimination. And while the courts will, likely take up that issue as well under the civil rights under Title VII. It's likely to be quite some years before that decision comes down, and we can't wait for that to happen. So we do need our legislature and other state legislatures around the country to enact those protections by law, and that's one of the areas. The other is also to make sure that we have protections in public accommodations, and that right now during the pandemic, it couldn't be clearer that the public accommodations protections is so crucial. A healthcare provider, emergency healthcare provider, can actually deny a person healthcare based on their sexual orientation or gender identity, and that's just that we can't accept that. That's horrible. It's unconscionable. So we have to get these fairness acts throughout the country, not just in West Virginia, adopted. We need to do it on a state level. It's called the Equality Act. That's the a similar bill, comparable bill that's before Congress, and we need that to be voted on. And then we have the other pieces of legislation that we've talked about earlier, hate crimes legislation to protect us from violence based on sexual orientation, gender identity. And we also want to make sure that the dangerous and discredited practice of conversion therapy is banned.
Okay, great. So Andrew, good luck
Sheila,
to you.
Did I get kicked off again?
Well, no, I hear you. I'm going to sign off with you. I'm going to thank you for coming on and showing us how beautiful West Virginia is and the wonderful work that you're doing there. We'll stay in touch, and we'll see you next time, and we'll see everybody next time on Talkback. So thanks again, Andrew, for talking to us from beautiful West Virginia. Bye.
Thank you.